Our first reading is from the proposed revisions to Article 2 of the Unitarian Universalist Association Bylaws. This is a section of our bylaws that includes our purpose statement, our core values, and some important statements around freedom of conscience and inclusion in our congregations.
Am I going to put the slide?
Yeah, and if you could show the little flower petal diagram.
That's what Katie was sending the email about.
Yeah.
There you go.
Thank you, Linda. This image was a gift from a UU who was inspired by Unitarian Universalist, who was inspired by the Article 2 work to give it a visual image. And so it's a flower petal with different colors and a chalice, which is a symbol of our faith, with love at the center. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, these shared values are interdependence, justice, transformation, equity, pluralism, and generosity.
Some of you may know, some of you may not know that this past June, we elected a new president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Her name is Dr. Sofía Betancourt. She's awesome. I think we're going to be in good hands. It's kind of an exciting time. It was super exciting 6 years ago when Susan Frederick Gray was elected, and this feels like just that continuation of that energy of kind of moving to where we want to be in the world. So these are words of Reverend Dr. Sofía Betancourt. Liberation, grounded in the perspectives and lived experiences of people of the global majority, demands ongoing reflection and action. It requires the presence and wisdom of many to fully embrace. If we are to build from a liberal to a liberal and liberative theology, as I am called to do, we cannot do so outside of the covenants and the commitments of our community. Let us build a Unitarian Universalism together that is humble, that expects little from those who have been made to sacrifice much, that prioritizes its commitments to faithful living even when we don't quite know how to make our way. This is the Unitarian Universalism I believe in. Right now, I think it is on a journey somewhere from liberal to liberation, and I'm orienting myself toward the day when those words have new and fully empowered meanings in the world. Kathy.
I am Kathy Burek. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a short, 70-something white woman with chin-length gray hair. I'm wearing a black short-sleeved shirt with the flower petal design that represents the new proposed values for the Unitarian Universalist Association. If you've been a member of this congregation since 2017, you've heard the story of my first few months on the UUA Board of Trustees, Unitarian Universalist Association. And I'll try to remember to spell out the acronyms. We are just terrible at this, the whole alphabet soup of words and phrases we use. I was nominated to serve a 3-year term on the board to begin in June of 2017. However, a vacancy on the board resulted in my being appointed in late March, about 3 months early. Before I even attended my first board meeting, then president of the UUA, Reverend Peter Morales, had resigned amid controversy over racism in our hiring practices. By the end of my first week, 2 other senior leaders of the UUA had resigned, and the association was in turmoil. For many long-time white Unitarian Universalists, the idea that our liberal religion had a white supremacy culture problem and was unwelcoming to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color was a shock. At that time, people of color were not well represented in UUA paid leadership positions at the association level or even in our congregations. People of color began to speak openly of the hurtful behavior on the part of white people in our congregations and in our association. And as the congregation progressed over the next several years, transgender people and disabled people began to share their feelings of not being fully accepted in UU congregations. The UUA had tried and failed to address concerns of its people of color many times in its past. Each of these efforts made some improvements for at least a while, but were typically abandoned when financial difficulties arose. It was clear that this time, UUA leadership had to take strong action and ensure that the effort would endure from one administration, one presidency to the next. Thus, the Commission on Institutional Change was created to examine the culture, structure, and processes of the UUA to see how these prevented the full participation of people with historically excluded identities. While most UUs responded by working to understand the concerns of Black, Indigenous people of color, or BIPOC UUs, over 2/3 of our congregations participated in anti-racism teach-ins during the spring of 2017. Delegates at our 2021 General Assembly voted by well over 80% to support a resolution to require that the Article 2 Study Commission ensure proposed changes to Article 2 that include a clear and direct statement that accountable, systemic anti-racism and anti-oppressive actions to build beloved community are part of what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. Anytime you can get Unitarian Universalists into that 80% agreement, that's pretty significant. However, a small group of UUs has resisted the idea that white supremacy culture could apply to us, or that we should change the culture of our association and our congregations to be more welcoming of people who were not highly educated, white, middle to upper middle class people. Based on numerous votes on resolutions relating to anti-racism and votes in UUA elections, this group numbers about 12% of General Assembly delegates. During my service on the board, I have read thousands of comments on the Article 2 process. I was one of the board's representatives and liaisons to the Article 2 Study Commission, and I continue to work with them even now that my term on the board has ended. I've read thousands of comments on the proposed draft, on the nearly 500 proposed amendments to the draft. I've received emails from many UUs about the UUA's work to fulfill our commitment to being anti-racist, anti-oppression, and multicultural. I've listened to statements made at General Assembly. And every month, I and other members of the UUA board hear from those in favor and those against the direction of our association is taking. Interestingly, arguments for and against our anti-racism work claim to honor our liberal religious heritage. As I've reflected on how UUs can interpret our faith so differently, I have concluded that there is a difference in theology that underlies these differences. As I see it, some UUs have a libertarian view of liberal religion, while the vast majority affirm that being in community entails accepting some limits on how we behave together. For UUs with historically marginalized identities, our conventional understanding of liberal religion needs to move towards liberatory religion. Today, I'll be sharing my observations of the liberal, libertarian, and liberatory threads in Unitarian Universalism today. This sermon is not intended to be a piece of scholarship. I'm not engaged in extensive research, and I won't be citing a lot of texts. Whew, thank goodness, right? I'll be sharing my impressions, and I'm certain that others will see things differently. Liberal religion, including liberal Christianity, places a high value on freedom of conscience and tolerance. Liberal religion also places a high value on science, critical thinking, and rationality. A very strongly secular version of humanism was the dominant force in Unitarian Universalist congregations at the time of the merger between the Unitarians and the Universalists, and it continued for many decades later. Mid to late 20th century UU humanism was marked by a strong commitment to individual freedom of conscience and a reluctance to grant leadership much authority or freedom of action. This congregation, founded as it was by people who were members of First Unitarian Society, which was the flagship humanist church in our association, carried a lot of that culture into this church in its early days. Our UUA bylaws assure freedom of conscience by prohibiting any congregation from imposing a creedal test. Thus, there are no required statements of belief to join a UU congregation. In contrast, evangelical Christianity and other conservative religions reject the teachings of science if it contradicts Scripture. Asking questions and pointing out inconsistencies in the Bible is discouraged. Challenges to authority are not permitted, and a refusal to adhere to orthodoxy will likely get you excommunicated. Many UU adults have come to our congregations as a result of bad experience with conservative churches. For UUs, the written and spoken word have primacy. I've been in many discussions among UUs where a dictionary is used to define the terms we're using. We tend to discount personal experience in favor of the objective, missing the importance of those things that cannot be measured. Resolutions, particularly at General Assembly, have been subjected to extensive wordsmithing. I've seen UUs debate the wording and even punctuation of a resolution at length, only to have the resolution passed by 90% margins. So the substance is often not in dispute, but we've got to get those words right. The nearly 500 amendments to the proposed Article 2, some were substantive changes, some very vigorous disagreement with what was being proposed, but an awful lot of them were simple editorial kinds of things. Again, this drive to perfection in the words. Our near obsession with words has often substituted for concrete and meaningful action on issues of importance. I can still remember the late Alandria Williams, when she was one of our co-moderators, mumbling under her breath about the focus on the words when her people, African-American people, were being murdered out in the streets. This was about the time of the murders of Michael Brown and other people of color, particularly young men of color. Some UUs have taken the idea of individual freedom to an extreme. It is this group whose views I consider to be libertarian rather than liberal. For the libertarian UUs, freedom of conscience is understood to mean you can believe anything you want. This is not true and never has been. For some, you can believe anything you want has become, I should be able to say anything I want, regardless of who is hurt. There are those, particularly older white people, who feel they should be heard whenever they want, even if they don't have a direct stake in the issue. A low point of a General Assembly debate a few years ago was hearing cisgender people offer amendments to substitute for the pronouns that were preferred by our transgender folks. There is a certain entitlement mentality at work when people not directly impacted by an issue feel that they should be able to tell members of an oppressed group how to solve the problem. Many libertarian UUs are especially offended by two concepts in the proposed revisions to Article 2, accountability and covenant. Being accountable for this group is considered an infringement on freedom of conscience and with the threat of punishment. Some folks in the libertarian group believes that the language of accountability will result in ministers and lay people, and maybe even congregations, being excommunicated for disagreeing with UUA leadership. Yet, all the proposed changes merely say, quote, "We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love." If we are not willing to commit to living our values, what good are they? The person in our story today clearly understood the idea of being accountable to love. They saw pain and took steps to heal it. That is true accountability. The idea of covenant is also troubling to the libertarian UUs for much the same reason as their objections to accountability. They see covenant as an infringement on individual liberty. They ignore our long history as a covenantal faith, dating back to at least the 17th century, as well as ignoring the language in our current bylaws that establish the 7 principles as a covenant among our member congregations. The covenant proposed for the new Article 2 says, "We covenant, congregation to congregation, and through our association, to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love." If the UUA member congregations are not willing to assist and support one another's ministries, do we really have a meaningful association? And how can one argue with basing our mutual support on freedom, reason, hope, courage, and love? These are core values of liberal religion, not just libertarian religion. The libertarian view of Unitarian Universalism, in my view, is inadequate to the needs of an increasingly diverse U.S. population. It is inadequate to redressing the spiritual harms done by settler colonialism, enslavement, and economic inequality to BIPOC, disabled people, and gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people. It is absurd to suggest, as some UU libertarians have, that systemic racism and oppression are absent from our structure and our cultures. Unitarian Universalism traces its origins to the Pilgrims. This association and its member congregations are not immune from the racism and oppression that is part of U.S. history. Even conventional liberal religion needs to take a hard look at itself if it is to be relevant in the 21st century. The work of the past 6 years has moved Unitarian Universalists to confront the ways our UU history and culture have not served BIPOC, GLBTQ, or disabled people well. Where conventional liberal religion has fallen short is its lack of attention to differences in power dynamics based on race, class, gender, and sexual orientation and ability. The idea that any issue is open for debate and that both sides have equal value fails to acknowledge that some issues have a greater impact on some people than it does on others. Asking those who have been historically oppressed to share their pain to prove that they have been oppressed is cruel. And one of the critiques of the Commission on Institutional Change report is that it wasn't peer-reviewed. We didn't have statistical measures, as though the idea of harm to people has to be statistically significant before it can be taken seriously. This is one of my biggest frustrations with the libertarian wing of our faith. However, liberatory religion calls on us to be uncomfortable, to examine where things are going wrong, and to accept responsibility. It calls on us to listen to those who have been ignored. Liberatory religion, in my view, builds on the best of liberal religion in recognizing and respecting individual conscience in matters of religion. However, liberatory religion goes well beyond the liberal emphases on the individual to an understanding that we are as important as I. Liberatory religion acknowledges that none of us is free until all of us are free. As the Reverend Yinyan Soto writes, "To actually be free, you must know and you must fight for the entire universes inside everyone else. Being free is not a license, but a promise." Liberatory religion asks of those of us who have held power due to our race, gender, or social class to stop talking and listen to those who have been historically excluded. This practice can be very uncomfortable. We may hear truths about ourselves and the institutions we value that might cause us to be embarrassed or ashamed. Yet shame is not the purpose of these conversations. Instead, we are called upon to make amends, apologize, and acknowledge the hurts. As individuals, we need to be willing to hear that a remark we thought was harmless was in fact hurtful. We are called to understand where we continue to benefit from past oppression, put a stop to it, and make some kind of reparation. And reparation does not just mean signing a check. That's cheap grace. Reparation at its root means to repair. And the work of repairing these relationships, the harm that we as a dominant culture have done, is going to be difficult. Liberatory religion calls us to see issues of injustice not just as bad behavior by individuals, but as a product of complex systems. Liberatory religion brings forward our Unitarian Universalist heritage, and in particular the Universalist heritage, as noted by the Commission on Institutional Change. A Universalist theology of liberation in the present day centers our capacity to be sanctuaries of radical truth-telling and abundant compassion, so that the all-embracing love at the center of our tradition can serve to make us whole. Liberatory religion in practice includes such things as having space that is accessible to people with disabilities, anticipating, not just responding to possible needs. So, for example, I gave a visual description of myself at the beginning of this talk. If somebody in this audience happens to have low vision or no vision, they would at least have some sense of who I am as a person by that visual description. Some of you might have been thinking, well, we don't need to know that she's an old white lady. We've known Kathy for years. So again, we're here to kind of make sure that at any point the person who joins us who has some kind of accommodation need can feel welcome when they walk in the door. So here we have a space for wheelchairs. So far, we haven't had anybody come into this space with a wheelchair, but we never know, and so we make the space. We have captions. Zoom is kind enough to provide those for us, occasionally with kind of quirky or incomprehensible results, but they're there. So somebody who doesn't hear well, somebody who may not be able to if lip reading is okay, but if they can't lip read, they can see the words on the screen. We even have Braille versions of our gray hymnal, although that took the concerted effort of 2 former members who were visually impaired to get the UUA to actually produce those. It was several years after the publication of the smaller version. But again, it's here. If anybody comes in and they're not sighted, they're in the back of the closet. Well, we can make that accommodation available to people. So why should we move to liberatory religion? Isn't good old liberal religion good enough? Well, if we put love at the center, as proposed by the Article 2 Study Commission, then the well-being of each person is important to us. Living our values of justice, equity, interdependence, pluralism, generosity, and transformation requires a shift in our perspective. We need to move from what the Reverend Fred Muir calls I Church, small I, where we demand that the church meets our needs, to a we church, or an all of us church. We become religiously mature when we work to meet the spiritual needs of everyone in our communities, when we learn from others whose life experience and worldview are different from ours. A liberatory faith understands that structures and systems of oppression are harmful to all of us, even members of the dominant culture. Liberatory faith goes beyond mere tolerance to the celebration of differences. As the proposed value of pluralism states, we celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. Love is at the heart of liberatory faith. When we act from love, we are moved to a deeper understanding of community. This past 6 years shows that a significant number of Unitarian Universalists are ready to move into becoming a liberatory faith. The UUA's commitment to anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multicultural work has consistently received the support of 85 to 90% of our GA delegates. The proposed changes to Article 2, with their emphasis on covenant and accountability, move us even further toward being a liberatory faith. 86.6% of GA delegates voted to continue the conversation about the proposed Article 2 changes over this next year. Frankly, I was shocked. I thought if we got a little over 50%, we'd be doing well. But instead, the reception at General Assembly for the Article 2 Study Commission was deep and enthusiastic. There's some percentage of people who voted in favor of moving the proposal forward for the purposes of discussion. They don't necessarily agree with it, but they're willing to talk about it, which is true UU fashion. But the Commission's own amendments, let me step back a minute. The only amendments proposed to the Article 2 proposal that were accepted by the General Assembly were those that the Article 2 Study Commission agreed to accept. And by, again, 70–80%. The amendments offered that the Commission was opposed to, many of which would bring us back to either the libertarian or the more conventional liberal view of things, went down, again, by significant margins. And so I feel fairly comfortable in asserting that the move toward liberatory faith is alive and well and has very strong support in this association. The changes being proposed to Article 2 have one more step to go through. The Commission is currently at work incorporating the amendments that were offered, and these included adding spiritual development to the purpose of the association, building new UU communities to the purpose of the association, an affirmation of the use of the democratic process in our congregations, in our association, which is an interesting oversight in our current ones, and in the society at large. Adding back in some language relating to mystery and wonder as being some of the sources of our inspiration, and then a certain amount of wordsmithing on the value relating to interdependence. The Commission is going to be incorporating these. The Commission is also working with a consultant to put the draft into what is known as plain language. Plain language is a way of writing and speaking that is more easily accessible, including to people who might be neurodivergent, than what often passes for the writing and speaking, particularly in Unitarian Universalist congregations, where we are very guilty of using graduate level words when a fairly simple word would do, using complex sentence structures. And so the Commission is in the process of making those changes, and you'll be seeing the new draft sometime in September. There'll be another period of comment, maybe I know there will be more amendments suggested, and subject to a vote by the 2024 General Assembly, which will be all virtual, if 2/3 of the delegates support the proposal as amended, that language will become part of the UUA bylaws. I, for one, am excited to see us move from liberal to liberal and liberatory faith. I have learned so much from listening to UUs of color, from listening to transgender people, and listening to people with disabilities in our movement. Being on the UUA board during this time of transformation and working with the Article 2 Study Commission has been a tremendous gift. I've begun to see the world through the eyes of people not like me more deeply than ever before. Liberatory faith, for me, adds a dimension to liberal faith that I didn't even know was missing. I believe that Unitarian Universalism, as we lean more strongly into being a liberatory faith, our movement will be revitalized and we will begin to live into our promises. May it be so.